Golden Age stars with the worst hair transplants. What if I told you that some of Hollywood's most dashing Golden Age heartthrobs were secretly walking around with hairlines that looked like they came straight out of a doll factory? Back then, hair transplants were still in their dark, experimental days, crude techniques that often left stars looking far more bizarre than bald. These leading men thought they were saving their image, but instead, they became unwilling guinea pigs for Hollywood's earliest cosmetic experiments. The results? Shocking, tragic, and sometimes downright laughable. Before we pull back the curtain on these jaw-dropping follicle fiascos, drop a comment below and let us know where you're tuning in from. One lucky viewer will even win a rare classic Hollywood DVD box set, featuring 25 unforgettable films from the very stars we're about to expose. So get ready, because you're about to uncover the most embarrassing hair secrets Tinseltown ever tried to hide. Frank Sinatra. Frank Sinatra, the so-called chairman of the Bad Hair Board. Long before cosmetic enhancements became common in Hollywood, Sinatra took a gamble in the early 1960s with one of the very first celebrity hair transplants. Sadly, it was a gamble that didn't pay off. The crude plug technique of the time meant surgeons literally punched out tiny circles of hair from the back of his head and planted them onto his thinning crown. The result? Exactly what it looked like, rows of doll-like plugs sprouting in neat, unnatural patterns. Photographers scrambled to save his image, hiding the patchwork with clever lighting and strategic camera angles. But close-up shots from the era betrayed the truth. His scalp looked more like a garden bed of hair plugs than the smooth, iconic Koi fans expected. To make matters worse, Sinatra's natural hair texture clashed with the transplanted strands, different curls, different directions, impossible to tame. He drowned it all in heavy pomade, hoping careful combing might disguise the chaos. The most humiliating moment came during a 1965 television special. Under the blazing studio lights, Sinatra began to sweat. The heat melted through his careful styling, and suddenly, the plug pattern stood exposed for the nation to see. Makeup artists scrambled in during every commercial break, frantically spraying, powdering, and patching up the legend whose hairline was betraying him one bead of sweat at a time. Burt Reynolds. Burt Reynolds, the bandit's rug revelation. Burt Reynolds may have risen to stardom just after Hollywood's golden age, but his hair transplant disaster in the early 1970s became one of Tinseltown's most infamous cautionary tales. What was supposed to restore his confidence turned into a decades-long battle against botched surgery. Multiple procedures left him with a hairline so low and straight it looked as if it had been painted on, giving Reynolds the unnatural, wig-like appearance critics couldn't stop mocking. The transplanted hair grew in uneven patches, with dense clumps sitting awkwardly beside bare spots, a visual reminder of Hollywood's obsession with image gone wrong. Reynolds himself later admitted the truth. It was a mistake. He confessed he should have embraced baldness rather than chasing an illusion. Yet instead of walking away, he spent decades undergoing more surgeries, each one carving fresh scars, damaging his hair follicles, and worsening the original problem. By the end, the corrections became impossible, leaving permanent marks on a man once celebrated for his rugged masculinity. The tragedy of Burt Reynolds' hair saga wasn't vanity alone, it was the irony. His raw charisma, magnetic charm, and undeniable sex appeal were never about the hair. They came from his confidence, his laughter, and his undeniable star power. He didn't need a perfect hairline to be the bandit. Hollywood may have tried to sculpt him into a false ideal, but Burt Reynolds was always at his most attractive when he was unapologetically himself. Sammy Davis Jr. Sammy Davis Jr. and the Rat Pack's infamous hair disaster. Few Hollywood legends had the charisma to pull off baldness quite like Sammy Davis Jr. His natural look carried a charm that perfectly fit his personality and performance style. But in the late 1960s, a fateful decision changed that forever. Davis underwent a hair transplant that left him with a bizarre, artificial hairline that didn't match his age, his face, or his effortless cool. Instead of restoring youth, it looked like he was wearing a toupee made of his own hair. The plugs at his hairline created a thick, unnatural wall of follicles that clashed with the thinning sides and back of his head. On stage, the harsh nightclub lights only made things worse, casting strange shadows across the transplanted patches that looked anything but natural. Desperate to hide the botched procedure, Sammy styled his hair into dramatic pompadours, drowned it in heavy products, and combed it with precision. But the illusion never fully worked. In fact, the constant chemicals and styling only weakened his real hair, trapping him in a cycle of damage control. By the 1970s, Davis had resorted to layering extensions, transplants, and clever comb-overs just to maintain the appearance of a full head of hair. Ironically, the man who once radiated confidence and flair with his natural baldness ended up chained to a fragile illusion, a reminder that even icons aren't immune to Hollywood's obsession with youth and image. William Shatner, the Captain's cosmic hair catastrophe. William Shatner may have boldly gone where no man had gone before, but his hairline took a far stranger journey. Back in the late 1960s, during his Star Trek years, Shatner turned to the era's primitive hair transplant procedures, and the results were nothing short of legendary, though not in the way he hoped. Using the crude plug technique, surgeons planted thick rows of hair that looked more like a doll's brush than anything found in nature. The outcome was an oddly dense, immovable hairline that refused to age along with him. While Shatner's face showed the natural march of time, his hair stayed frozen in place, an eternal artificial curtain that only fueled speculation. Fans couldn't help but joke about how his hair seemed to defy the laws of biology, clinging stubbornly to his scalp as though it belonged to another man altogether. Worse still, the plugs were set too close together, creating an almost comical uniformity. Instead of blending naturally, the hair screamed surgical, becoming a running gag among both fans and critics. To make matters worse, the transplants left permanent scarring, ensuring that Shatner could never completely shave his head, locking him into his cosmic coiffure for life. It was a hairline that became as famous and infamous as the Captain himself. Tony Curtis. Tony Curtis. Some like it transplanted, though in his case, Hollywood wasn't laughing. Starting in the 1960s, Curtis embarked on one of the most infamous hair transplant journeys in show business, and it became a decades-long obsession. Unfortunately, the early techniques used on him were crude and unforgiving, leaving his scalp with an unnatural, cornrow grid of plugs that looked more like rows of crops than human hair. On film sets, makeup artists scrambled to disguise the obvious pattern, but the results were never quite convincing. The real embarrassment came with time. As Curtis aged, his natural hair turned gray, yet the transplanted strands stayed jet black, creating a jarring two-tone effect that made the fakery impossible to ignore. In a desperate attempt to blend it all together, he began dyeing his hair, but the flat, uniform color only made things worse, artificial on top of artificial. Still, he couldn't let go. Every few years he returned to surgeons, trying to repair the damage of past procedures, each new surgery leaving his scalp more scarred and fragile than before. What began as vanity spiraled into obsession, and instead of preserving his leading man image, the endless interventions left him with one of Hollywood's most infamous cautionary tales. Mel Gibson. Mel Gibson, once the fearless road warrior, found himself battling a very different kind of enemy, his own hairline. His hair transplant, though done long after Hollywood's golden age, carried the same haunting flaws that scarred countless stars before him. Instead of restoring his rugged charm, the procedure left Gibson with a harsh, unnatural hairline, too straight, too dense, and too artificial for a man of his years. Hair restoration experts call it the forest fire effect, patches of thick, unnatural growth surrounded by barren bald spots. The result? A style that looked more like a cover-up than a comeback. Directors had to hide him in shadows, tilt cameras at just the right angle, and pray the lighting didn't betray the obvious plugs. For Gibson, even stepping in front of the lens became a delicate balancing act. What made it all the more tragic was that Gibson's natural, receding hairline had given him a distinguished, mature edge, perfect for the complex roles of his later career. Instead, the transplant erased that authenticity, forcing a mismatched, youthful hairline onto an aging face. Instead of making him look timeless, it made him look trapped between two worlds, the Hollywood hero he once was, and a man chasing an image that no longer fit. John Travolta. John Travolta, the disco king turned hairline headline. His battle with baldness began in the 1980s, right after Saturday Night Fever in Greece had cemented his image as a heartthrob with thick, enviable locks. But when the hair started thinning, Travolta turned to transplants, procedures that promised restoration but delivered something closer to a cosmetic disaster. Instead of a natural look, he was left with a hairline so sharp and symmetrical it seemed drawn on with a marker. Real hairlines have quirks, little irregularities, but Travolta's looked engineered with a ruler and compass. To make matters worse, the transplanted strands grew with a different texture from his real hair, creating a visible dividing line that no styling trick could disguise. Gone were the tousled, carefree looks that once made him a style icon. And then came the cruel twist of timing. Just as Travolta's career exploded again in the 1990s, with Pulp Fiction pulling him back into the spotlight, new high-definition cameras exposed every flaw. Every interview, every red carpet appearance magnified the mismatch. The once dashing star wasn't just judged for his roles anymore. He was ridiculed for his hair. Elton John. Elton John, the legendary Rocketman, may have soared to unimaginable heights on stage, but his hairline never quite took flight. In the 1970s, desperate to fight off baldness, Elton turned to early hair transplant procedures that proved more curse than cure. The primitive punch graft technique left his scalp dotted with small, circular plugs of hair arranged in painfully obvious patterns. The result was patchy, uneven, and nearly impossible to style, a look far worse than going bald naturally. Instead of restoring confidence, it left him with a head of hair that grew in odd directions, with strange densities that betrayed every attempt to disguise it. But Elton John, ever the master of reinvention, didn't let failure stop him. He abandoned the doomed transplants and leaned into a new solution: flamboyant wigs and elaborate hairpieces. What could have been an embarrassing setback became a defining part of his theatrical persona. By embracing wigs as fashion statements instead of hiding behind them, Elton transformed a personal struggle into one of the greatest reinventions in entertainment history. His fake hair became just as iconic as his sequin jackets and oversized glasses, proof that even in loss, the Rocketman knew how to turn life into spectacle. Sean Connery. Sean Connery may have been the ultimate James Bond, but his hair certainly didn't have a license to kill. In the early 1970s, Connery turned to hair transplants in a desperate bid to hold on to his signature look, but the results were nothing short of disastrous. The primitive plug technique of the era left his scalp dotted with unnatural circular patches, and the transplanted strands didn't even match the color or texture of his real hair. On screen, the effect was jarring, turning his once rugged image into a patchwork that fans couldn't ignore. But here's the twist worthy of a Bond script. When Connery finally gave up the fight and embraced his baldness, his career, and his image, only grew stronger. The clean-shaven look gave him an air of authority, sex appeal, and sophistication that no toupee or transplant could ever match. In doing so, Connery shattered the Hollywood myth that baldness was a curse for leading men. Instead, he proved it could be powerful, masculine, and undeniably attractive. His bold decision inspired a generation of actors to ditch the wigs and embrace their natural look, cementing Connery not just as a movie legend, but as a style icon who redefined what it meant to age with grace. Marlon Brando. The Godfather's hair offer you could refuse. Marlon Brando, the man who redefined acting with The Godfather and A Streetcar Named Desire, carried a secret that haunted him for decades. Behind the brooding eyes and magnetic performances lay a cosmetic disaster he never wanted the world to see: his failed hair transplants. In the 1970s, Brando turned to the experimental world of hair restoration. But instead of restoring his confidence, the crude procedures left him scarred, embarrassed, and trapped in a cycle of cover-ups. The surgeries created a hairline that looked unnatural, too low, too straight, and painfully artificial. Worse, the transplanted plugs sprouted in wild directions, leaving his scalp looking, as one makeup artist cruelly put it, like grass pushing through cracked concrete. The damage was permanent. Scars across his head made shaving bald impossible, so Brando spent the rest of his career hiding beneath wigs, hairpieces, and carefully staged lighting. He became so self-conscious that he refused to be photographed without some form of disguise. The tragic irony: his natural baldness would have suited the rugged gravitas of his later roles perfectly. Instead, he became a prisoner of a botched cosmetic experiment. Back then, the so-called miracle of punch grafting was more nightmare than cure. Surgeons would cut out round plugs of scalp, about 4 millimeters wide, and replant them into thinning areas. The results were doll-like clumps of hair, surrounded by circular scars that looked like polka dots. Worse, the plugs ignored natural growth patterns, sending hairs sprouting in random, jarring directions. The technology was primitive, the artistry non-existent, and Brando was one of its most famous victims. But the deepest wounds weren't on his scalp, they were in his mind. The botched transplants left him riddled with insecurity. He obsessed over angles, lighting, and styling, fearing exposure at every turn. Like other Golden Age stars who underwent similar disasters, Brando fell into the psychological spiral now recognized as body dysmorphia, where the fixation on flaws became all-consuming. Hollywood adapted by building a secret, cover-up industry. Specialists were hired to disguise scars, style transplanted patches, and even adjust lighting to soften the illusion. Publicity photographers became magicians, mastering angles that could hide the damage. Behind the glamour, an entire hidden economy existed just to keep these legends looking whole. Ironically, the suffering of Brando and others paved the way for progress. Surgeons learned from these celebrity disasters, developing modern techniques that prioritize artistry, natural growth patterns, and patient counseling. Today, hair restoration can be subtle, effective, and safe, but only because stars like Brando bore the humiliation of being the industry's unwilling test subjects. Their stories remind us of a powerful truth. Sometimes, the most dignified choice is to embrace age and authenticity rather than chase illusions. Brando's talent was immortal. His failed fight against baldness only proved how even the greatest legends can fall victim to vanity, and how Hollywood will stop at nothing to protect its illusions.